College presents The Making of Medieval Illuminated Manuscripts by Dr. Sally Dormer, the V&A.
Well, I am going to this afternoon be talking about how medieval illuminated books were made. There are a multitude of ways of looking at medieval manuscripts. You can take very broad approaches and think about issues like patronage or function. Or you can be much more focused in your approach and think about very specific aspects of manuscript production, perhaps zooming in and thinking purely about the script in which the texts were written, the study of paleography. Or you can limit yourself to looking at the style of the illustrations in illuminated manuscripts, a more art historical approach. But in taking this subject from the perspective of how a book was made, I hope that it will provide a foundation or a starting point to approach manuscripts from, whether you know something about this topic already or whether it is completely new to you. And I hope to convince you that even if you are looking at an illuminated book through a sheet of glass, which is often the case because manuscripts are fragile and are generally displayed under low levels of light in glass-topped cases, you are still able to deduce a great deal about a manuscript for yourselves. The very word manuscript, if you dissect it, tells us something about all the books that you're going to be seeing in this session. That is, that they are all handmade. And the word manuscript, of course, means written by hand, if you take it apart. And that's exactly what the man dressed in the garb of a Benedictine monk with a tonsured head is doing here. We'll return to this image of a mid-12th century scribe later on. But in order to produce the books that you're going to see in this session, you would have needed to be skilled at far more than simply writing with a quill pen. And in order to give you a sense of the variety of skills necessary to produce the kind of books that I'm going to be showing you, I want to begin by reading, in translation, an Anglo-Saxon riddle, which comes from a collection of Anglo-Saxon riddles that are held within a book known as the Exeter Book, which you can buy in Penguin Classics. The riddle reads like this: An enemy ended my life. He took away my bodily strength. Then he dipped me in water and drew me out again and put me in the sun, where I soon shed all my hair. The knife's sharp edge bit into me once my blemishes had been scraped away. Fingers folded me, and the bird's feather often moved across my brown surface, sprinkling useful drops. It swallowed the wood dye and again travelled over me, leaving black marks. Then a man bound me. He stretched skin over me and adorned me with gold, and thus I am enriched by the wondrous work of smiths and wound about with shining metal. There are two solutions or answers to that riddle. The obvious one is that it's referring to a book. But if you go back to the opening line, an enemy ended my life, another solution would be an animal of some sort. Because all the books that you will see today, and indeed the majority of books made in Western Europe before the introduction of paper here in the late 14th century, are made from animal skins. Animal skins that had been transformed from being rather flexible and slippery and hairy and smelly into smooth, stable, de-haired, flat surfaces, which were ideal for the application of ink and pigment. The two creatures that you see here from a 12th century manuscript of astrological material You're looking at two of the constellations, Taurus at the top and Aries at the bottom, a book today held in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Just illustrates for you some of the creatures whose skins went into the production of medieval books. You can make parchment, which is what I'm going to call it, from any creature you wish, whether it's a squirrel or a mouse or a horse. But given that animals in the medieval period were expensive commodities, you would tend to find that books were made from the skins of animals that were reared primarily for their meat, and that their skins were then used as a byproduct for the production of parchment. And so in most of Western Europe, it was calfskin or sheepskin that was most typically used. In Italy, goatskin too. I'm not going to use the word vellum. If you're being pedantic, as most manuscript historians are, you only reserve the word vellum when you are sure that the page you're looking at belonged to a calf, because the word vellum is derived from the Latin vitulum, for a calf. And it's often quite difficult to be sure whether you're looking at the skin of a calf or some other kinds of creature. Thus, the word parchment is safer because it doesn't denote any specific animal. The production of parchment is a relatively simple process, and one that has remained unchanged into the present day. And it's one which is described fairly in a detailed way in a number of medieval sources. I'll come to this initial, which is found in a mid-13th century German Bible in a moment. But the beginning of the process of making parchment involved cleaning your skins. And this was done by pinning them down with boulders or pebbles in a shallow, fast-flowing stream or river very often for a day or two in order to clean them of impurities. And then you took your skins and you packed them into wooden barrels or vats that you had filled with a mixture of lime, that was chalk dust, and water. The lime loosens the structure of the animal's skin. It opens up its pores, essentially, so that after a week in that solution, you were able to take your skins out and, using a wooden paddle, slough off all the hair of the pelt of the animal, which you didn't want on the page of your manuscript. Then you rinsed your skins thoroughly in clean water to rid them of lime. And at this point, the initial that you can see on the screen comes into the process. Now, most medieval Bibles are illustrated with subject matter that's derived from the biblical text of the Old or New Testament. But when this Bible was made in 1255 for Hamburg Cathedral, it lives today in Copenhagen, in the Royal Library there, somebody made the decision to approach the illustration from a different point of view and decided to fill the initials which herald the opening of each of the biblical books with little snapshots from the production of an illuminated manuscript. So you're going to see 3 or 4 of these initials from the Hamburg Bible as we go along. This one has in its background the rectangular wooden frame onto which you pegged out your skin once it had been cleaned and de-haired and rinsed. As the skin was set outside in the sunshine to dry, it was smeared with a paste of chalk dust, which enabled you to stretch it ever tighter. And as it was stretched, you scraped it on both sides with a half-moon-shaped knife of the sort you can see here, called a lunellum. The knife is shaped in this way without a point to minimise the risk of puncturing the skin, which, because it was so tightly stretched, would have ripped and torn badly if you had put the point of a knife through it. Once the skin had been scraped to an even thinness on both sides and had dried, you took it off the frame and there was your piece of parchment. That's how relatively simple the process is. Now, the two individuals who inhabit this initial are interesting because they tell us something about the nature of the people who were involved in making books in the medieval period. The man on the right-hand side, who is taking delivery of a trimmed-down sheet of parchment, is dressed in a black cowled Benedictine habit. He also has a halo around his head. He's probably meant to be Saint Jerome. But the fact that he's receiving the parchment sheet indicates that he is involved in the production of a manuscript. And prior to the early 13th century, almost all manuscripts were made in monasteries, many of them by monks. There were some itinerant professional artists, but most scribes and many artists who worked on books were based in monastic centres. That's where collections of books were kept, and that's where manuscript production took place. After the beginning of the 13th century, things began to change. And with the rise in the spread of universities in Western Europe, particularly in England, Oxford, in France, Paris, in Italy, Bologna, you begin to get the demand for books growing amongst an increasingly literate laity who were focused in urban centres. And so manuscript production ceases to be the preserve of monasteries and monks and moves instead to urban centres to satisfy the demand for books there. And as this occurs, the whole production of books becomes a more commercial process. And as well as there being fewer ecclesiastics involved in the process, post-1200, the majority of books are increasingly made by lay men and sometimes women. The numbers of people involved in the production of a book increases too, as book production becomes more conveyor belt-like. So you get increasing professionalisation. You have professional parchmenters, and that's probably what the man on the left here is. He has a white fabric coif over his head, indicating that he is a layman, and he has a bundle of parchment leaves under his right arm. You also get professional scribes who simply copy texts. You get professional artists who are responsible for supplying illustrations to books. So the whole realm of book production becomes more commercial and much larger than it had been in the earlier medieval period, when one man may have been responsible for making parchment, copying the text in a book, and providing decoration and illustration, and then binding the book at the end of the process. Now, because the Hamburg Bible was made in 1255, it shows the transition between the two situations I've described. The producer of the manuscript here, by implication, is still monastic, but the supplier of the parchment is a professional layman. Once you had taken your sheet of parchment off the frame, in most instances, you got on with thinking about the format of the book that you were going to be making. But for a select, very tiny number of books, you thought about dyeing your parchment. This is a fragmentary manuscript called the Sinope Gospels, which lives today in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, made in the 6th century. No one is quite sure where, but perhaps in Alexandria. And you can see that it is written in Greek, perhaps, and that the letters of the text are golden. This is an example of what's called chrysography, writing with golden ink. And the page surface here is not creamy and white, but purple. The dye that has been used to stain the skin will have come from a member of the whelk family, a kind of mollusk, which was rare, and the dye was thus very expensive. The colour of the purple dye alters over time, so sometimes what are described as purple books can look rather reddish or brownish in hue. But the important thing is that at the time they were deemed to be purple. And this meant that they were almost certainly destined for an imperial patron, whether that be from the early 9th century onwards a Western emperor. The first of the Western Roman emperors, of course, being Charlemagne, the Frank, or in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, a Byzantine emperor. And it is likely, given that this book is in Greek, that this was destined for a Byzantine emperor's use, continuing a tradition of imperial authority being linked with the colour purple that goes back into the classical Roman period. These two images are intended to show you how much you can tell about the status of a book purely by scrutinising its parchment carefully. The page on the left comes from a 12th century chronicle known as the Worcester Chronicle because it was composed by two monks from Worcester Priory. One was called John and one was called Florence. They were both monks. And the book today lives in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I'm showing you a page with illustrations, in case they're distracting, which depict two dreams which Henry I, King of England, suffered when he was in Normandy. When two of the estates of his realm came to him in dreams to complain about the poll tax that he had exerted on them. So these are peasants with their pitchforks and spades coming to complain, and these are the men who fight for a living, knights. The third estate, churchmen, also complained about the poll tax, and they're shown on another page. This page comes from a book which was never meant to be a luxury volume, and the parchment tells us that. You will perhaps not be able to see as clearly as you would if you had the real thing in front of you, that the page is rather grey, not just down here. This is probably finger grease from where people have turned the pages, but the whole page has a sort of greyness to it, which suggests that the animal skin from which it's made was not very carefully cleaned at the beginning of the making process. Down at the bottom right-hand corner, intruding into Henry's bedhead, there is a hole, a rounded hole with a slightly pointed top, which is consistent with the kind of areas of scar tissue which animals have on their hide if they have been bitten by certain types of insect. The scar tissue that heals over the bite or boil is thinner than the rest of the animal's hide. And so when the skin is stretched and scraped, the scar tissue comes away, leaving you with a little hole. Now, if it had been possible to procure higher quality parchment, or if this had been a liturgical book used in the public rites of worship in the church, this sheet of parchment may well have been discarded in favour of something more perfect. You would also find, if you had this book in your hands, that the skin has not been scraped very beautifully. The page is slightly stiff and board-like. The impression of this being a fairly utilitarian, functional book is amplified by the fact that the text panel and the illustrations almost entirely fill the page. Parchment was an expensive commodity. If you were trying to save on resources, you made the most of the page surface. So here, that has been done. And again, perhaps to economise, the illustrations have not been fully painted or gilded, but instead they are drawings with restricted washes of colours. If you're wondering who the men are in the margins, this is Henry I's doctor, who is peering at a sample of Henry's urine to try and find out what it is that's making him ill. The page on the right-hand side presents a contrast. This is a high-quality devotional book from which a man or woman said their prayers. It was made circa 1200, somewhere near Oxford, and it's a psalter, which means that it has the Psalms within its covers, together with illustrations. You're looking here at a page from the prefatory cycle of illustrations, which warn you what the souls of the damned are to expect in hell, which is why these little naked figures are being munched and boiled and grilled and so on. This book, which now lives in Munich and is thus known as the Munich Psalter, is made from very high quality parchment. You can see that it's clean and creamy, there are no holes, and if you could feel the page, you'd find that it is of a similar thickness to high quality modern day paper. So it's flexible, but not stiff. And the picture here, which is fully painted with a wide variety of pigments, with frames to each of the compartments supplied in gold, is surrounded by a very generous blank frame of parchment that does nothing but set the illustration off to perfection. All of this indicates clearly that this is a high quality, costly product. And it's like this either because the person who had it made could afford these high quality materials, but I think also because a devotional book from which you said your prayers will have been thought more befitting of high quality materials than a simple chronicle or history book. The other thing you can tell about parchment when you're looking at it in a case is whether you are looking at what was the hairy side, which is known as the grain side, or the flesh side of the skin. Now, where the page is buckled a little here in the Munich Psalter, I hope you can see that there's a reflection. The page catches the light here and here, because this is the flesh side of this animal's skin. And when it's prepared, it is very smooth and shiny and reflective. And it tends, therefore, to look paler and cleaner than the hairy or grain side of a skin, which you can see in a detail here from a Worcester Cathedral Library manuscript of 12th century date, which has an initial C that contains a man wrestling with a bear. If you look at the surface of this page, you'll find that it is velvety, suedey. It's rough if you feel the page between your finger and thumb, and it looks slightly grubbier, even though it isn't, than the flesh side of an animal's skin. And sometimes on the hairy or grain side of the skin, you will find, as in this book, which is part of Waddesdon Manor's collection of manuscripts. This is a mid-13th century Italian Bible, and you're looking here at the letter to St. James in the New Testament, with a detail of the full view of the page on the left. You will find drifts of little tiny black spots, which show you where the hair follicles, the dark hair follicles of the animal who owned this skin, were originally situated. So if you're interested in things like the marking of 13th century domestic animals, books can be rather useful at helping you to reconstruct what they may have looked like. But those little spots always occur on the hairy side of the animal's skin. If you are able to turn the pages of a medieval book, you will find, by gently rubbing the pages between your finger and thumb, that there is a regular pattern of hair side and flesh side. You will generally find a hairy side facing another hairy side, followed when you turn the page by the opposite. So hair, hair, and then flesh, facing flesh. And the reason for that regular pattern has to do with the way in which the sheet of parchment, once it had been taken off the frame and trimmed down, was folded in order to achieve the format desired for the book that was being made. These are two more initials that come from the Hamburg Bible. And the one on the left shows a monk sitting at his desk with a trimmed down rectangle of parchment in front of him. He's cutting another piece from it with his ruler and knife. Now, it may seem to be stating the obvious, but all animals that I can think of, apart perhaps from tortoises, have rectangular skins, because animals are always shaped with rectangular sides with legs at their four corners. So if you take a skin off any creature, it will essentially be rectangular. And once you have folded it however many times you needed to get the requisite size of your book, you will always be left with a rectangle. That is one of the reasons why the majority of medieval books are rectangular in shape. And it's interesting that even after the introduction of paper, when you could have rethought the format of a book, that was not done. By that point, I think the rectangular format was so entrenched and familiar, people didn't want to depart from it. So if you were going to make a large public manuscript, perhaps to be put on a lectern in an abbey church, you may have folded your sheet of parchment just once. If you pretend this is a sheet of parchment and I fold it once, you end up with what's called a bifolium. That is 2 folios joined together by a crease down the middle. That means that for some very large books, each page is the size of the side of an animal, a calf or a sheep or a goat. But books for more private use were much smaller. And for those, you would have carried on folding your sheet of parchment 2 or 3 times in half, resulting in a little packet, a rectangular packet of parchment, which when you took a knife and cut along the top and the foredge creases, will have left you with what's called a gathering or a quire, Q-U-I-R-E, which consists of a number of bifolia stacked inside one another. And if you want to try this for yourselves at home, before you start folding your rectangular sheet, label one side with H's and the other with F's to denote the hairy and the flesh sides. And when you have folded and cut, as I described, and you turn the pages of your little fictive gathering, you will find that regular pattern of hair side facing hair, followed when you turn the page by flesh facing flesh. That's why it occurs as it does. Now, by this point, you had been fingering the parchment, and it may have been a little greasy. You had also been smoothing it quite a lot when you folded it, and it may have become so smooth that it was not going to be possible for the nib of a pen or a brush to grip the surface. So you abraded the surface of your skins, your parchment, and this is what this man on the right is doing of the Hamburg initial here. He has a little piece of pumice stone in his right hand, and he's rubbing the surface of the open bifolia in front of him. Calligraphers use pumice dust today for exactly the same purpose. Now you are ready to prepare your folios for writing. Now, just as some of us have problems writing in a straight line across a blank sheet, so too did medieval scribes, and they couldn't cheat in the way that we can do by buying Basildon Bond notepaper and slipping pre-ruled sheets under the blank sheets, because parchment wasn't always translucent enough to do that. So what scribes did was to come up with a clever system which allowed them to prepare a whole stack of gatherings or quires in one go, with a series of little tiny marks called prick marks, which prevented them from having to rule up a grid pattern laboriously page by page. Most medieval books have been rebound, and they've lost their original bindings, And if they were rebound prior to the second half of the 20th century, the odds are that they were cut down. The edges of their pages were clipped to neaten them. And as this happened, the prick marks disappeared. But I'm showing you a detail here of a mid-13th century life of St. Edward the Confessor, which was made here in London at Westminster. It's a court manuscript made possibly for Eleanor of Castile, Edward I's wife. It lives today in Cambridge in the University Library. And you're looking here, so that you're not distracted by it, at an illustration of on the left of the poisoning of a king who crops up in Edward the Confessor's life story. He's called King Arthur Canute, and he's poisoned whilst he's eating dinner, which is why he appears to be climbing over the dinner table. And on the right, we have got a bishop who is kneeling in prayer. But what I want to show you are these little tiny marks made by the point, perhaps of a knife, which punctuate the edges of the folios at regular intervals on the foredge of the page. If you look at the distance between them, you'll find that it is exactly the same as the distance between the lines of text below. And what the scribe did, and you can see this from another of the Hamburg Bible initials, was to place a stack of closed gatherings or quires on his desk. He decided how deeply spaced he wanted his prick marks to be. He pierced the edges or the foredge of his gatherings, and when he opened the gathering up, he will have had one set of prick marks down here, another down here, and all he needed to do was join them up with his ruler and another implement, which I'll come to in a moment, in order to get a repeating grid, which was exactly the same in its dimensions from page to page throughout the book. Now, the materials with which the grids were ruled up change over time for reasons that are not yet fully understood. But prior to the year 1100, and then again in Italy in the 15th century, there was a preference for what is called hard or dry point ruling. This means that the parchment was scored with a hard or dry point, possibly metal, possibly bone or ivory, with an implement that must have looked a bit like a stylus. It leaves a groove on the parchment page, which is really only visible if you tip the page to raking light. And here you're looking at another manuscript from Wadston Manor, a late 15th century devotional book, a book of hours, which is a prayer book used by lay men and women, which was made in Florence. And you can see that the grid is almost invisible to the naked eye. It doesn't intrude. All you are faced with is the regularity of the text panel. By the end of the 12th century, it had become far more usual for scribes to rule up their grid patterns with what is called lead point. It literally means a little piece of lead. Looks rather like pencil, but it's not quite the same as modern-day pencil. And that has been done on the left-hand side for the September calendar page of the Munich Psalter, the high-quality book I showed you earlier. Calendars were a usual attachment to psalters and books of hours, devotional books, and they contained useful information of a variety of sorts, including the feast days of saints, what are called golden numbers to help you work out the date of Easter, and so on. So they needed quite complicated grids because they were carrying a series of different pieces of information in tabulated form. And here you can see that using lead point, you have a grid which has remained on the page. You could have rubbed the lead point out if you'd wished once you had written the content of the page, but more typically it was left and becomes part of the decorative element, the design of the page, along with the decoration and the text. And if you look carefully, you can see that whoever ruled this grid ruled the lines from left to right, because the firmness of each line occurs at the left, and then it tails off and becomes fainter towards the right, where the pressure has been left off as the ruler moves from left to right, ruling up his grid. By the 14th century, the fashion had changed again, and scribes, instead of using lead point, start to use pigment, very often a magenta-coloured pigment or paint, to rule up grids which again remain on the page and become part of the decorative design of the page. On the right, you're looking at a text page from an early 16th century book of hours, again from Waddesdon Manor's collection, a book that was made by the workshop of a famous late medieval French illuminator called Jean Bourdeschamps, whose workshop was in Tours. And this text page still carries its magenta-coloured lines of the grid. And this is also a rather good example to show how scribes didn't actually write directly on the line of the grid. They wrote just slightly above it with admirable, enviable regularity. At this point, perhaps, it is appropriate to introduce you to one or two scribes whose names we know. Many scribes were anonymous, and they are only known well by paleographers who can identify the minute differences between the script of one scribe and another. But some scribes were famous, and they were either commemorated in books by other people, or they sometimes included little self-portraits in their work. Here are two monastic scribes, so 12th century scribes. On the left, the man you saw at the beginning. This is a portrait, I use the word advisedly, from the back of a Psalter manuscript which lives today in Trinity College Library in Cambridge. It is named after this man, Eadwin. He was a monk at Christ Church Priory in Canterbury in the middle of the 12th century, and he was presumably highly regarded. He was probably the scribe and perhaps the man who designed the Eadwin Psalter, as it's known, which is a tremendously complex book in terms of its layout. I will show it to you in the lecture on Psalters at the end of this series. And we know that he was prized because there is a Latin versed couplet that runs around the inner edge of the frame, which in précis says, I am Eadwin, the prince of scribes. Neither my fame nor my glory will ever die. Now, I think one shouldn't jump to conclusions and presume that it was Eadwin praising himself. I think this is an image of him which was either inserted to commemorate his contribution to the book or perhaps to commemorate him if he died during the book's production. So one doesn't necessarily have to accuse him of big-headedness, but his fame certainly has survived into the 21st century, and that I think he would have been happy about. He's shown holding the two implements that scribes are generally shown holding. In his right hand, and most medieval scribes are shown as right-handers, as a left-hander, I noticed that, the pen is made from a feather, the quill of a feather, and various sources, including a very interesting technical treatise called De Diversis Artibus, that was written in Germany by probably a Benedictine monk who used the pseudonym Theophilus in the early 12th century. He advises you to use the wing feather of a goose because it's sturdy. and the feathery bit was clipped off. So medieval scribes are not shown with that sort of romantic feathered plume which we might expect. The implement in his left hand is a knife, and knives were vital for a number of things. They were used for cutting parchment, they were used for keeping the page flat as you wrote, rather than putting a greasy fingertip on the parchment, and they were also used for correcting mistakes, because the kind of ink that medieval scribes wrote with was very often what is called encaustic, which means that in addition to having something like wood dye in it, which gave it its deep, dark quality, it also had iron filings added to it, which meant that when it was applied onto the parchment, it literally burns itself, hence the word encaustic, into the structure of the animal's skin. And if you spotted your mistake quickly enough, you literally had to scrape off the top layer of the skin to eradicate it. So the knife was multifunctional. It was also used to sharpen your quill pen when it became blunt. And I ought perhaps to point out that although Eadwin is shown writing into a bound book, that is an artistic convention. The binding came right at the end of the making process, as the Exeter book riddle indicated, because it is much easier to write and illustrate onto flat pages rather than bound pages, which are always slightly curved. You may be wondering whether only monks made manuscripts. Nuns did too, sometimes. And on the right, you have got an example of this. Here, a little self-portrait of a nun called Guta, who was a member of a nunnery near Hamburg in northern Germany in the 12th century, who describes herself here as the sinner Peccatrix, who was also the scribe and the painter Pinxit of this book. But although some nuns were very skilled at manuscript making, they tended to be less involved in this sort of activity, because it's been proved that in order for a monastery to support a flourishing scriptorium that made books, you needed the combination of an enthusiastic abbot and money. And nunneries tended to be less well endowed than monasteries, so there was less money to spend on things like making books. Here is a lay scribe, dressed in lay clothes, a man called Jean Milot, who was a scribe for two of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century, Duke Philip the Good and Duke Charles the Bold. And here Jean is shown in a domestic setting, in a bedroom, beside a fire, laboriously copying out a text. And this reminds us that when a scribe sat down to write in the medieval period, he was rarely composing a text. More often than not, he was making a copy of an exemplum which he will have procured from a variety of means. So here, the exemplum in a bound book is open above on this ingeniously little supported angled desk, held open with a cleverly designed weight. And down below, Jean has an unbound bifolia in front of him, and he is making a copy of the text above on a quite steeply pitched desk. This seems to be the angle that was preferred in the medieval period, and the desk has little holes in its side in order to accommodate spare quill pens and little pots of ink. Now, laboriously copying hour after hour is why scribes made mistakes. The best of scribes must sometimes have got tired, and when they went back to their copying, their eye either jumped down the page and they missed something out, or they may have looked back up the page and started to copy something they'd already written. So even the best of scribes made mistakes on occasion. Now, a page of text like this one from that Waddesdon Manor Bible that I showed you earlier makes it clear that there was a fairly traditional approach to the writing of a text. The body of the text was written first in encaustic ink, leaving little spaces for initials which were going to be supplied on a larger scale than the rest of the text and in colour. And spaces were also left for illustration, which I will get to in a moment. So generally speaking, you will find, as you can see from this detail here, that when the scribe got to this point, he indented these 3 lines of the text because he knew that he was going to be coming back afterwards to put in this coloured initial S with contrasting blue flourishing, which signalled to the reader that this is the beginning of a new chapter, in this case in the book of Deuteronomy, if you look at the running title at the top of the page on the left. And if you look closely, you'll find that the colour of initials of this sort always lies on top of the brown ink text, displaying the order in which these things were done. And the other thing that you can see from a close-up like the one on the left is the way in which scribes could hasten the production of a text and reduce the amount of parchment it was going to take up by employing a standardized system of what are called abbreviations. If you look at the laser pointer, you will find that 6 lines up here on the right, there is a P with a strange little hook projecting to the left of its down stroke. This is the standardized abbreviation for the Latin word pro. If you'd written it out in full, it would have occupied the spaces of 3 letters, P-R-O. But by using the abbreviation, it contracted it, making it speedier to write and taking up less space. So heavily abbreviated manuscripts give away the fact that they are not luxury books where every word will have been written in full, typically. And one last embellishment for text pages, if your book needed to look beautiful as well as to be useful, you may have supplied it with what are called line fillers, where your line of text ended before the end of the line, leaving you with a space. You might fill it, as here, with a little decorative wriggling dragon with a foliate tail, and the borders were filled with different types of ornament depending on the date of the book. In this instance, cost will not have been even thought of, because this is a royal manuscript made in the 1320s for a member of the French royal family in Paris. It's a little tiny Psalter manuscript, which comes in part, at least, from the workshop of a great Parisian illuminator called Jean Poussel. And it lives today in Wadston Manor's collection. And this sort of border decoration is called baguette ornament, for obvious reasons. Now, I ought to say that only 5% of medieval books were ever lavishly decorated or illustrated. The majority of books were simply filled with text. And even for an illuminated book, and the words illuminated, I should explain, initially referred to books with lots of gold on their pages, so that the light caught the gold and literally illuminated the book. Today the word is used more loosely to refer to books with lavish amounts of decoration or illustration. But even where you have lots of illustration, the text is still of the greatest importance. The illustrations are there as adjuncts to help you to understand better the content of the text. So, with that proviso, let me show you some illuminated books. And to begin with 2 books which were made in the same place at roughly the same time in the 1470s and 80s in Rouen, in Normandy. Both of these are books of hours made for lay patrons. The one on the left is in Wadston Manor's collection. The one on the right is in the V&A's collection in London, although sadly it's not out on display usually. It's called the Playfair Hours. And you are looking at the opening of the section of text known as the Gospel Pericopes, a selection of extracts from the Gospels narrating the life of Christ. You can see here a glimpse of how artists might have worked in the realm of commercial later medieval book production. They were trained in workshops. There were established ways of doing things. They learnt by experience. They were trained up in certain traditions. And you can see that each book here has a frontispiece which is very similar, divided into quadrants, a round-topped frontispiece, where even the citing of the figures in the quadrants is the same. The men here are the gospel writers or evangelists, St. Matthew with his angel, St. Mark with his lion, St. Luke with his ox, and St. John with his eagle. And this is a reflection, I think, not of copiously made pattern books or model books, very few of which have survived, suggesting that artists did not use those typically. But instead, I think this reflects the way in which workshops talked to one another and communicated and came up with labour-saving ways of producing illustrations. And that has given rise to people suggesting that medieval artists had no room for invention, no room for self-expression. To a degree, that may be so, but there was a little bit of wriggle room. If you look at the image of St. John in each illustration, you'll find they're not quite the same. In the Wadston Hours, John's eagle hops on one leg behind the writer. In the Playfair Hours, and I think this must have been a decision on the part of the artist rather than the patron, the eagle has come round to the other side and is helpfully standing in front of John, holding aloft a pen case and an ink pot in his beak. The decisions of what to put in the margins is more likely to rest with the patron, because additional little miniatures like those in the Playfair Hours of John the Baptist and John the Evangelist being boiled in oil will have cost more than the decorative motifs in the borders of the Wadston book, which are filled with things like butterflies and birds and this little hybrid creature hobbling along on a pair of crutches. Now, most medieval books with illustrations are complete, which makes it difficult to survey the progression of the production of a miniature being a framed, freestanding picture or illustration. But I'm going to show you 4 images from a book called the Douse Apocalypse. Apocalypse is an illustrated version of the last book of the New Testament, the Revelation, or Apocalypse, the vision of St. John, of the last days running up to the last judgment and the second coming of Christ, which lives today in the Bodleian in Oxford and was interestingly never finished. It was made in the 1260s in London. It's another court manuscript, and it was probably made for Edward, Prince Edward at that point, who, after his father's death in 1272, became Edward I. Edward left in 1270 to go on crusade, and one theory is that this book was never finished because he was absent, and perhaps therefore not paying the producers of the book to continue. But it's fascinating from our perspective because some of the illustrations, like this one, which is actually towards the end of the book, show very early stages where the design of this illustration has been first of all drawn up, can you see, in lead point, these dusty grey lines visible on the surface suggest a preliminary lead point sketch, which perhaps transferred a sketch which the artist had done on a wax tablet initially onto the parchment. And then he firmed it up with brown ink except for some areas like the water down here, he's confident enough to sketch it straight in with no preliminary lead point sketch. Gold was then applied, and where you find gilding in a book, it always came prior to the application of pigments, because pigments were expensive. And because gilding involved the application of gum or glue and the burnishing, the rubbing of the gold to make it shine. And you didn't want to be using sticky gums or burnishing the gold and run the risk of spoiling your precious pigments. So you gilded first. And here we've got gold leaf, gold that's been hammered to leaf-like thinness between sheets of parchment. And this book has gold leaf applied directly onto a layer of gum or glue that's been painted onto the parchment. So the gold is relatively flat. But you can, if you look at the initial from a Worcester Cathedral Library manuscript here of the late 12th century, put a cushion under your gold leaf. This is normally a kind of plaster or gesso which has been coloured with a pink or red pigment, so that you build up your cushion of pigment, and the gold, when it's laid on the top, appears thicker than it really is, and it also catches the light spectacularly and sparkles. Red is chosen as a ground because, rather like in panel painting, where you tend to put a sticky red bowl under your gilding, it endows the gold with a warmth which is lacking if it's put straight onto white parchment. And there is another way of preparing gold, which is to grind it up and mix it with gum as a binding medium and apply it as paint. That has been done for the initial B on the right-hand side, which comes from a late 10th century psalter in the British Library, which I will show you more from in the next lecture. It's known as the Ramsey or Harley Psalter. And it was made for an Archbishop of York, and is therefore, perhaps not surprisingly, gilded with gold paint, which is much, much more expensive than gold leaf. It's been estimated that if you ground up the amount of gold leaf that would cover 4 letters, you end up with only enough gold paint powder for the dot on one eye. So if you see granular gold, which is pigment and not leaf, you're looking at a very expensive book. Next, the pigments. And the subject of pigments could fill a lecture in itself. What I will say to give you an overview of the topic is that by the middle of the 13th century, the artists who worked on the Douse Apocalypse in London would have probably gone to an apothecary to purchase their pigments of the sort that you see here in a late 14th century manuscript all about health. The text is called the Tacuinum Sanitatis, and this copy lives in Vienna. And by the middle of the 13th century, rather than having to rely on what was available in your native locality or what was sporadically available through trade, artists were pretty much able to get hold of whatever pigments they wished. And pigments fell into 3 main categories: organic pigments that are translucent, derived from naturally occurring plants and animals. Mineral pigments that are made by grinding up minerals, and they tend to be quite grainy and opaque. And then manufactured pigments, which are the largest category of all, made by subjecting a variety of materials to different chemical reactions. In the Douse Apocalypse, this semi-finished illustration, which occurs interestingly quite early on in the book, shows the gilding has been applied, and then the artist has laid on a uniform wash of medium-toned colour. And the paint would not have adhered to the parchment if it was simply mixed with water and painted on. You needed, in addition to water, what's known as a binding medium, which was either very often a kind of glue, extracted either from plants or made by boiling up little scraps of parchment. Or they often used egg white, clarified egg white, which you whipped up as if you were hoping to make a successful souffle. And then you let it settle, and the colourless liquid that results is very efficient at binding your pigment onto the page. And of course, this is not quite finished yet, but this Daus Apocalypse image is. The artist, having applied the middle tone of pigment, has come back and put in darker tones to convey shadows and paler tones to pick out highlights. Now, I'm going to take you now to the end of the process mentioned in the riddle, where the book is described as being placed between boards and bound. To do this, having completed the writing and the illustration, you needed to make sure that your choirs or gatherings were in their correct order. And this was particularly important in the later Middle Ages, when choirs were farmed out to different scribes and artists. The binder, who by that point was probably a professional binder, needed to be sure that they were in the correct order so the text made sense. And sometimes books that have not been cut down when they were rebound maintain evidence of how that was done. This is the little tiny royal psalter from the Waddesdon Manor collection I showed you earlier from 1320s Paris. And it still has what are called catchwords. I'm sorry I'm not showing you the other side of this opening in the book, but if I could, you would find that the little phrase down here, which begins Ides, will be the first line of the text panel on the next page. And this signals to the binder that this is the end of the previous gathering, and it goes with the next gathering, which has the opening words at the top that are as the same as the catchword down here. So having assembled your gatherings or choirs, which sometimes are numbered rather than given catchwords, as in this instance, in the correct order, you then stitched with linen thread across the spine of the gatherings to keep them together. And then you stitch the spine onto a series of leather thongs, which had been mounted at regular intervals onto a frame. The thongs looked a little bit like shoelaces, and their loose, floppy ends on either side of their central portion, where they'd been stitched onto the spine of the gatherings, were then threaded through tunnelled grooves in the two rectangular wooden boards that had been pre-cut, usually from heavy woods like beech or oak, intended to keep springy parchment leaves as flat as possible. And these boards were the covers for the book. So you threaded your thongs through the tunnel grooves, you pegged them into place where they emerged from the board, and you were left with a sandwich of parchment gatherings with a board on either side. A flat spine punctuated by the ridges of the leather thongs. And the next decision was how to cover the boards. This depended on the function of your book. The illustration on the left shows you a school book, a scholarly 12th century text from Flanders, which lives today in the chained library at Hereford Cathedral, which is why it has the chain attached to it. That was to stop the canons at Hereford from wandering off absent-mindedly with books from the library. And here, because this is a utilitarian volume, the boards have simply been covered with leather, stretched over the boards, glued in place, and then the leather has been stamped with a hot metal stamp that leaves an indentation, providing a decorative pattern on the binding. You can see the wooden board underneath where the leather has come away here. But if your book was going to perform a liturgical function, like the gospel book on the right, and it is gospel books that tended to be treated in this way, you gave your book what's known as a luxury binding. Sometimes on both the front and the back cover, in this instance in a gospel book that lives in Trier Cathedral Treasury today and was made in northern Germany in the early 1100s. It is just the front cover, which has been embellished so that intrinsically it's more valuable than the parchment leaves inside it. But the book was deemed worthy of that treatment because this is the Word of God. And so we have a cover that reminds us of the content of the book. Copper repoussé gilded plaques with the symbols of the four gospel writers, sandwiched between the arms of a cross, the symbol at the centre of the message of Christianity, set with originally a sumptuous array of cabochons or polished gemstones, encrusted filigree twisted wire soldered onto the base, and little strips of golden cloisonné enamel. Many of the gems have now fallen out, but what survives still proclaims the splendour of this book, which may have been held aloft in a procession and then placed on an altar for reading from during the celebration of the sacrament of the Eucharist. And both these books have little hinges or clasps here on their foredges, which are a typical addition to keep the book closed, to protect it from dust and damp and damage when it isn't being used. My last pair of images takes us into the 15th century when a new type of binding had been devised known as a chemise binding, literally a shirt binding, which is the medieval precursor of the modern-day dust jacket in a way. The chemise binding is made from supple leather or fabric, very often costly materials, dyed beautiful colours. And you slip the boards of your book into the loose fabric or leather chemise binding, which was much bigger than the dimensions of the boards. Incidentally, the boards in a medieval book are always exactly the same size as the pages inside it. The boards didn't overhang the edges of the pages in the way that modern hardback books are. So when you closed your book, you could wrap the flaps of textile or leather around it in order to protect it. And this was the sort of binding which was often used for private devotional books, like books of hours. And that, I think, is what Mary Magdalene is meant to be holding in her hands here, engrossed in her devotions. She is identifiable from the little white alabaster jar of precious ointment on the floor beside her, and she's sitting with her back up against a rather nice 15th century cupboard and saying her prayers from a book which is exquisitely written, has the edges of its pages gilded, and sports a pair of goldsmith's work clasps with standing figures on them, probably saints. And this comes from a fragment of an altarpiece painted by the great Netherlandish painter Roger van der Weyden in the first half of the 15th century. And very few of these chemise bindings survive because they are, of course, very delicate and prone to damage. To conclude, you might have thought that the advent of printing in the late 15th century will have been the death knell of the handmade book of the sort that you have seen in this lecture. But if anything, the production of printed books catapulted the status of the handmade book into an ever more appreciated category. To be able to afford a handwritten and hand-illustrated book demonstrated both your taste and your spending power. So the production of handmade books did not stop all of a sudden, and the skills which I've been talking about in this session have persisted into the modern day. And thankfully, the admiration that people felt for these exquisite artifacts that provide a window into the world of the medieval scribe and artist and patron was so appreciated that these books have been carefully maintained, even if their function has long since been surpassed. They've been carefully handed down from generation to generation, so that today you can go and look at them for yourselves, which is what I would urge you to do, because however beautifully these books can be enlarged to show them on a screen of these dimensions, the real pleasure to be had in looking at a medieval book is to scrutinise the real thing on sometimes a very minute scale. Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.